The hospital room was quiet, but I could feel the judgment before he even said it. My father-in-law, Arthur, stood near the foot of my bed, arms crossed over his impeccably tailored suit, a stark contrast to the sterile, pale blue of the room. His voice, when it came, was low and certain, each word a carefully placed stone dropped into the fragile peace of the morning. "That baby isn't one of us." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I lay there, the aftermath of labor and aching exhaustion that seeped into my bones, my body feeling like a landscape irrevocably altered. Beside me, in a clear plastic bassinet, lay my son, Leo. Tiny, perfect, swaddled in a soft white blanket, his face serene in sleep, wisps of dark hair peeking from beneath the hospital-issued cap. He was oblivious, a small, warm presence untouched by the chilling pronouncement. My husband, Mark, stood a little to the side, near the window, the pale morning light silhouetting his frame. He looked away, out at the cityscape, his shoulders hunched. Silent. That silence was a betrayal sharper than any word. He was caught, I knew, in the cross-currents of doubt his father so expertly generated, and the duty he felt towards me, his wife. I saw the subtle flicker of his jaw muscle, the only outward sign of his internal turmoil. I wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice, to hurl back the accusation with the ferocity of a mother protecting her young. But the weight of childbirth, the sheer physical depletion, pinned me to the thin mattress. More than that, the sheer audacity of Arthur's claim, delivered with such calm conviction, left me momentarily breathless. It was like being struck by a rogue wave, the shock stealing the air from my lungs. My own voice felt like a distant, forgotten thing, trapped somewhere deep inside. The silence thickened, pressing in, amplifying the rhythmic, gentle sigh of Leo's breathing, the quiet hum of the hospital equipment. It was a silence full of unsaid things, of years of subtle disapproval now coalescing into the single, brutal moment. I remembered the first dinner after we'd announced the pregnancy. We were at Arthur and Eleanor's expansive home, the table gleaming with polished silver and crystal. Eleanor, Mark's mother, had been fluttery and excited, her joy a warm, genuine embrace. But Arthur had been quiet, his gaze analytical as he looked at me, at my barely perceptible bump. "Well, Sarah," he'd said, swirling the wine in his glass, his eyes never quite meeting mine with warmth. "This is unexpected news. You're sure about the timing of all this? Mark's career is at a crucial juncture." His words were always so carefully chosen, each one a polite veneer over a core of steel. Mark had shifted uncomfortably in his seat then, too, murmuring something about us being ready, about it being wonderful news. But Arthur's skepticism had been a cold draft in the otherwise warm room. It was the first seed, I realized now, planted so subtly. He'd always been a formidable presence, Arthur. A man who built his business empire from the ground up, a man used to control, to things going his way. I was not the daughter-in-law he would have chosen, I always suspected. I was too quiet, perhaps, not from a family with a recognizable name, my ambitions more modest, centered on a life of gentle joys rather than power and influence. He'd never been overtly unkind, not in a way I could easily point to and say, "There, that was cruel." It was always in the nuances, the glance that lingered a moment too long, the question phrased just so, the subtle way he'd steer conversations back to Mark's achievements, leaving me on the periphery. Now his arms remained crossed, a barrier between us. His face was set, resolute. He truly believed it. The thought sent a fresh wave of desolation through me. How could he look at that innocent child, his own grandson, and harbor such a monstrous thought? How could Mark stand there and let it happen? My gaze drifted to Leo again. His tiny rosebud mouth, the delicate curve of his eyelashes against his cheek. A fierce, primal surge of protectiveness rose within me, momentarily eclipsing the pain and exhaustion. He was mine. He was ours. This was a truth I knew in every cell of my being, a truth as profound and irrefutable as the ache in my body. "Mark," I whispered, my voice raspy, barely audible. "Please." He flinched as if my voice had physically touched him, but he didn't turn. His silence stretched, thin and taut. I could almost hear his father's voice in his head, the years of subtle insinuation, the carefully cultivated doubt. I remembered another time, midway through my pregnancy. I'd been tired, my ankles swollen. Arthur had been visiting, and he'd found me resting on the sofa. He'd asked about my health, his tone solicitous, but then he'd said, "You know, Sarah, fidelity is the cornerstone of any strong family. Especially a family like ours, with so much at stake." It wasn't a direct accusation, not quite. But the implication hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Mark had walked in then, and I'd looked to him, hoping he'd challenge his father, defend my honor. Instead, he'd attempted to mediate, a pained expression on his face. "Dad, Sarah knows that. We're both committed to this family." He'd squeezed my hand, but his words felt weak, an attempt to placate rather than confront. In trying to be neutral, he had inadvertently given Arthur's veiled suspicion a sliver of legitimacy. The memory brought a fresh sting of tears to my eyes, tears I refused to let fall. The sterile scent of the hospital room, the faint beeping from a monitor down the hall, the starched stiffness of the sheets beneath my fingers, every detail seemed to sharpen, to heighten my sense of isolation. I felt so utterly alone, adrift in a sea of accusation, with my own husband seemingly unable to throw me a line. My hands, resting on the thin blanket, trembled slightly. I wanted to reach for Leo, to hold him close, to shield him from this ugliness, but the bassinet was just out of reach from my reclined position, and the effort felt monumental. And then, just as the silence in the room thickened to an unbearable density, the door opened with a soft click. Dr. Evans stepped in. She was a calm, kind woman in her late 40s, with intelligent eyes and a reassuring presence. She'd been a pillar of strength during my labor, her voice steady, her instructions clear. Now she held a thin manila folder in her hand. She offered a small, professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, as if sensing the tension that saturated the air. "Good morning, Sarah." "Arthur." "Mark," she said, her voice a calm intrusion into the charged atmosphere. "Just came to see how you and the little one are doing, Sarah. And I have some information I thought it pertinent to share." My heart gave a small, anxious thump. "Information?" Arthur's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something, anticipation, in his eyes. Mark finally turned from the window, his face etched with a mixture of apprehension and exhaustion. Dr. Evans moved further into the room, her sensible shoes quiet on the linoleum floor. She didn't sit, but stood near the end of my bed, not far from where Arthur maintained his sentinel-like posture. The room's balance shifted subtly with her presence. She was an objective force, a bringer of facts. "Sarah, you had a straightforward delivery, and Leo is doing wonderfully," she began, her tone gentle as she addressed me. "He's a healthy, beautiful baby boy." She paused, then her gaze shifted, encompassing both Mark and Arthur. There were some discussions, some concerns voiced to hospital staff by Mr. Henderson Sr. prior to the birth, regarding parentage. Vague, but enough to note. My breath hitched. Arthur had spoken to the hospital staff? Before Leo was even born? The premeditation of it, the cold calculation, sent a chill through me. I felt a flush of humiliation creep up my neck. Dr. Evans continued, her voice maintaining its professional calm. "Normally, such matters are private, addressed by families themselves. However, given the intensity of the expressed concern and our primary duty of care to both mother and child, and frankly, to mitigate any undue stress on a new mother in the vulnerable postpartum period, the hospital has certain protocols it can enact. In rare circumstances, for clarity and to ensure the well-being of all parties, particularly when a potential dispute might affect the child's immediate care or family support. We are able to expedite certain tests if deemed medically or ethically necessary by the attending physician and a review board. She opened the folder. The rustle of paper sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. My gaze was fixed on that folder, a vessel of unknown significance. What could it possibly hold? During your pregnancy, Sarah, Dr. Evans said, looking at me kindly, we did the routine blood typing, of course. And for Leo, standard procedure is to confirm his blood type shortly after birth. She paused, then looked directly at Arthur, then Mark. Leo's blood type is B negative, a relatively uncommon type. I knew my blood type was A positive. I vaguely recalled Mark mentioning his once, but couldn't place it. Arthur remained impassive, though I thought I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Mark, Dr. Evans said, turning to him. Your blood type, as per the records you provided during Sarah's early consultations, is AB negative. Is that correct? Mark nodded slowly, his eyes wide, uncomprehending. Yes, AB negative. And Sarah, Dr. Evans continued, her gaze returning to me, is A positive. Standard genetics would allow for children with A, B, AB, or O types, depending on whether you are homozygous or heterozygous for the A allele and considering Rh factors. However, she paused, letting her words sink in. What is unusual, and what we felt compelled to verify given the circumstances, is a specific, rare antigen present in Leo's blood. It's called the KEL antigen system. Most people are KEL negative. Being KEL positive is uncommon. If a baby is KEL positive, at least one parent must be KEL positive. She looked at Mark. Mark, your medical history notes you are KEL positive, a trait you inherited from your father's side of the family. It's documented in your extended family's medical records, which we cross-referenced with your permission when you became a patient of this hospital network. Arthur's stony expression finally wavered. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. His arms, still crossed, seemed to press tighter against his chest. Dr. Evans continued, her voice steady and clear, each word precise. Sarah, your blood tests confirm you are KEL negative. Therefore, for Leo to be KEL positive, as his tests definitively show, he must have inherited the KEL positive antigen from his father. She looked directly at Mark, then her gaze shifted to Arthur, holding it for a beat. The biological father must be KEL positive. And Mark, you are. This specific genetic marker, passed paternally in this instance, is present in Leo. She held up a single sheet of paper from the folder. It was a lab report, columns of letters and numbers that meant little to me in their technicality, but the import was crashing down with the force of absolute truth. Furthermore, Dr. Evans added, her voice softening slightly, while not strictly necessary given the KEL antigen results, we also ran a standard, albeit expedited, DNA comparison using the legally permissible samples we had on file from Leo's birth and Mark's existing patient profile. The probability of paternity for Mark Henderson is 999%. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the thick, accusatory silence from before. This was a silence of shock, of unraveling. Arthur stood frozen. The certainty, the absolute conviction that had radiated from him seemed to deflate, like air leaking from a punctured tire. His arms slowly, almost imperceptibly, uncrossed. His gaze dropped from Dr. Evans to the floor, then flickered towards the bassinet, a brief, unreadable glance. He looked older suddenly, the sharp lines of his face somehow less defined. He didn't speak. He couldn't. What was there to say? His edifice of doubt, so carefully constructed, had been demolished by a few simple, irrefutable biological facts. Mark let out a ragged breath he seemed to have been holding for an eternity. He turned, slowly, not towards his father, but towards me. His face was a maelstrom of emotions, shock, then a dawning horror, followed by a profound, gut-wrenching shame that contorted his features. His eyes, when they finally met mine, were filled with an agony of regret. He took a hesitant step towards the bed, then another. He didn't speak, but his eyes pleaded, begged for a forgiveness I wasn't sure I possessed in that moment. Dr. Evans quietly placed the folder on the small bedside table. "I trust this clarifies the situation," she said, her professional duty done. "I'll leave you all. Sarah, I'll check in on you and Leo again later. Please, try to rest." She gave me a brief, empathetic look before slipping out of the room, closing the door softly behind her, leaving us in the wake of the truth. The tension hadn't entirely vanished, but its nature had changed. The judgment that had pressed down on me was gone, replaced by a different kind of weight, the weight of broken trust, of words that could never be unsaid. I looked at Mark, at the remorse etched so plainly on his face. Part of me, the part that still loved the man I married, felt a pang of sorrow for his pain, for the impossible position his father had put him in. But another, larger part felt a cold weariness. He had doubted. He had stood by. Then, my gaze went to Leo, still sleeping, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. He was the only thing that mattered. The accusations, the doubts, the familial drama, they felt distant, unimportant next to the overwhelming reality of my son. A small sound escaped him, a soft sigh, and his tiny hand twitched. Can I hold him?" I asked, my voice still a little weak, but clearer now. It wasn't a question directed at anyone in particular, but it was Mark who reacted. He moved quickly, carefully, to the bassinet. He hesitated for a moment, his hands hovering, then gently, so gently, he lifted our son. Leo stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment, unfocused and dark, before closing again. Mark turned, and with an almost reverent care, he placed Leo into my waiting arms. The warmth of his small body against my chest was a balm, a profound comfort that settled deep into my soul. I pulled the soft blanket more snugly around him, inhaling his sweet, milky scent. His head nestled into the crook of my arm, his wispy hair tickling my skin. I looked down at his precious face, at the perfect bow of his lips, the delicate flare of his nostrils. He was a miracle, my miracle. Arthur was still standing there, silent, diminished. He looked like a man who had lost his bearings. I didn't look at him for long. His approval, his acceptance, I realized with a startling clarity, no longer held any power over me. It had been a burden I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying, until it was suddenly, blessedly lifted. Mark remained standing by the bed, his gaze fixed on Leo, then on me. There were tears in his eyes now, silent tracks on his cheeks. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. There would be time for words later. Or perhaps not. I didn't know. What I knew was that this moment, holding my son, was sacred. I looked at Leo, my son, so small, so new, yet possessing an undeniable truth that had silenced empires of doubt. My love for him was a fierce, unwavering shield. My eyes locked on his peaceful face, and a quiet strength, a deep, unshakable sense of peace, settled over me. The approval I had once craved from others, the validation I had sought, it all seemed to fade into insignificance. All that mattered was this tiny, perfect being in my arms. The hospital room was quiet, but this time, I felt no shame. Only the profound, unyielding certainty of a mother's love, and the quiet, steady beat of my son's heart against mine.